There is no warning. The real fractures in silence. A banal gesture, the sound of a door, a pause in a dialogue, a gaze that doesn't return. And the air changes texture. Suddenly, everything that once seemed solid becomes an unstable film. The voices go on, the commitments continue, but something inside no longer believes in the scene. The mind tries to adjust its focus, like someone insisting on seeing clarity in a cracked mirror. It's in this interval that the first calling arises, not in words, but in vibrations, an ancient reminder that the visible world is only the outer face of a much deeper movement. The surface of life begins to unravel, and the invisible breathes through the newly opened crack. At first you believe it's just exhaustion, a confusing phase, maybe a build-up of sleepless nights, some vague dissatisfaction. But gradually, you realize it's not fatigue. It's the inner axis that has shifted. The certainties that once sustained daily life now feel fragile, like old furniture creaking under its own weight. Conversations lose color. Routines feel repeated by someone who is no longer you. Each daily gesture, each word spoken out of habit, reveals a strange distance between what you do and what you feel. It's at this point that the ego tries to maintain control. It reorganizes thoughts, seeks causes, builds explanations. Maybe I'm just stressed, the mind says. But there's something deeper, something that doesn't fit into diagnoses or advice. The body begins to respond differently. The air feels denser, time stretches, and the space around becomes silently strange. The energy that once moved along familiar lines now spreads out, like a magnetic field losing shape. And you, without realizing it, begin to float in the midst of the invisible. Disorientation is the first great test. There is no map, and every attempt to understand rationally only deepens the abyss. You try to keep the old rhythms, getting up, following schedules, smiling out of politeness. But inside, something shifts with almost cruel precision. What once seemed important, recognition, goals, control, loses its shine. There's a constant discomfort, as if you're wearing clothes that no longer belong to your body. Some try to escape this state by filling the void. Work, distractions, rushed spirituality. But nothing fits. The field that once seemed silent begins to move. Coincidences intensify, inner noises grow, and reality itself seems to respond to thoughts with subtle distortions. It's as if the universe, in a delicate yet relentless gesture, said, "Stop pretending. This moment is dangerous and necessary." The mind tries to categorize the chaos, but chaos doesn't fit into categories. Everything built upon illusion begins to dissolve, and with it comes a sense of loss, not only of what is external, but of the very self that believed it was in control. The personality, accustomed to defining itself through roles, functions, and expectations, begins to dissolve like ink in water. At first, there is panic. You reach for the old ground, logic, the comfort of opinions, the support of certainties. But the more you try to steady yourself, the more the ground gives way. It's like trying to stand on quicksand. Every effort to hold on only accelerates the sinking. And it's precisely at this point that the quantum field of awakening manifests, not as enlightenment, but as a collapse of frequencies. The vibration of consciousness, when it comes into conflict with the dense patterns of the ego, produces interference that disorganizes the old equilibrium. The collapse hasn't arrived yet, but its energy already vibrates in the air. You feel an invisible force reconfiguring your perceptions. What once seemed clear is now ambiguous. What was stable now pulses in waves. Time loses linearity. Memories come with the intensity of the present, and the future seems to approach in flashes of intuition. This confusion is not a mistake. It's the field trying to readjust the tuning of your consciousness. During disorientation, loneliness grows. It's common to feel that no one could understand what's happening, because there truly is no language that translates this phase. The world continues functioning as if nothing has changed, but you know, even without words, that something essential has broken. The old mental frequency can no longer sustain itself, and the body, which is the physical mirror of the soul, reacts with fatigue, electric sensations, or a strange sensitivity to the presence of others. Sometimes awakening begins to show itself as a mild discomfort, a mismatch between internal vibration and external scenery. The body wants silence, but the mind wants explanation. And in that conflict, the lesson of surrender arises. When the energetic ground dissolves, there is no other way but to learn to float. It is the beginning of trust in something not yet seen, faith as a vibrational state, not as belief. Nothing is solid anymore, but everything vibrates. What was once static becomes flow. Time bends, space breathes, and consciousness begins to perceive that chaos is merely the reconfiguration of the field. At this point, disorientation ceases to be an enemy. It becomes the womb of the new. Deep down, this apparent collapse is the way the universe opens space within you. The discomfort is only the friction of the soul expanding its contours. And when you finally stop fighting the dissolution, a silence begins to be born behind the noise. It's not the end. It's the invisible preparation for the real. The collapse doesn't arrive like thunder. It insinuates itself in small gestures, a tiredness that can't be explained, a sudden desire to stop following the script that always seemed right. Gradually, the world begins to lose density, forms dissolve, certainties fade, and the body begins to vibrate at a strange frequency, as if moving away from a place it can no longer inhabit. You try to resist, try to keep appearances, but the universe is relentless when it decides to respond to what your soul asked for in silence. It's not punishment, it's coherence. When the soul raises its own field, everything vibrating out of sync begins to crumble, and what once seemed like security reveals itself as only a temporary structure, a shelter made of thoughts. The plans that once gave meaning to things collapse like scaffolding that has fulfilled its purpose. You feel fear because the ego still believes it can negotiate with the inevitable, but the collapse is non-negotiable. It comes when there is no longer room for the false within the true. The breakdown doesn't happen from the outside in. The external world only reflects what broke in silence within you. The relationship that ends, the job that finishes, the project that fails. None of this is coincidence. These are visible reflections of an invisible reconfiguration. The vibration of your consciousness has shifted, and the field around you must reorganize. When that happens, the universe acts as a perfect mirror, returning only what resonates. What doesn't resonate disappears. The first reaction is to rebuild. You pick up the pieces, revisit old paths, search for logical explanations, but nothing fits. It's like trying to glue glass with wind. Time, which once obeyed your will, now behaves like an autonomous entity. Hours stretch. Days seem to repeat with secret intentions, as if reality itself were watching you. There's a constant sense of suspension, as if the ground has been removed and the air must learn to sustain you. The mind, in panic, looks for culprits. It attributes the chaos to external factors, people, fate, injustices, but the collapse is more intimate than it is the silent cry of consciousness demanding authenticity. Everything that isn't real must be undone. What you call failure is merely the soul's method of freeing itself from excess. What collapses is not life, it's the mask. Over time, the body begins to record the collapse in its own language. The chest tightens, sleep fragments, breathing becomes irregular. It's not illness, it's translation. The old energy is trying to leave the system, and the body, as guardian of the passage, feels the friction of the crossing. This is the moment when many try to escape. Some seek distractions, others run to spirituality as if looking for anesthesia. But awakening accepts no shortcuts. You must remain in the midst of the fall without haste to rise again. There comes an instant when everything seems still. No direction makes sense, no path feels trustworthy. You are between worlds. The old no longer exists. The new has not yet formed. Here, silence finds a voice. In the void between what dies and what is born, the universe speaks in subtle vibrations. It reorganizes you from the inside out, adjusting frequencies, dissolving memories that no longer serve expansion. Chaos is merely the laboratory where the real is refined. The most unsettling thing is realizing that even amid ruin, there is a strange serenity. Something in you observes the destruction without being completely shaken. That something is the fixed point of consciousness, the part that has never been touched by time. When you begin to recognize it, you understand that the collapse isn't tearing you away from the center, but returning you to it. The external disorder is only the echo of an internal realignment. Those who pass through this moment with surrender discover a simple truth. Emptiness is not absence, it is gestation. The silence that once seemed like death begins to pulse as a living, almost sacred presence. It is within it that the new prepares itself. The universe does not destroy out of cruelty, it destroys out of love for coherence. It knows that light needs space to expand, and sometimes, for there to be space, everything built upon fear must collapse. Over time, your gaze changes. Suffering still exists, but it no longer has the same weight. There's a quiet understanding that every loss was a disguised liberation. The collapse, once feared, reveals itself as the purest portal of awakening, because it is only when all that is false falls away that the true can remain. When the universe responds to your silence, it does not speak in words, it reorganizes, and in that invisible gesture, it invites you to be born again within your own consciousness. The collapse is the instant when the soul stops resisting its own greatness, and in the stillness that follows the fall, something indescribable begins to breathe. The real, without mask, without form, only pulsation. After everything collapses, the world seems to fall silent. The dust of the collapse still hangs in the air, and you walk among the fragments of who you were, trying to recognize some familiar shape. It's in this interval that the mirror appears. It's not the physical mirror. It's the subtle reflection the universe uses to return what you emitted without noticing. It shows up in the people who irritate you, in the mistakes that repeat, in others' gestures that wound, and at the same time, expose the shadows you tried to hide. At first, it's almost impossible to accept. You want to believe the problem lies with others, that the world is unjust, that life got the calculation wrong. But each face, each situation, each discomfort begins to act like a meticulous reflection. The enemy, the traitor, the indifferent one, all become vibrational mirrors, returning the exact point where you still deny what you are. The universe, patient and relentless, makes the other your teacher. At the beginning, it's cruel. Seeing yourself reflected in the one who hurts you is like being forced to watch your own movie under a different light. You realize that the same attitudes you condemn are distorted versions of your own. The anger you feel is the mirror of a part of you asking to be seen. Judgment is a veil that covers the fear of recognizing yourself. The mirror has no mercy because consciousness does not work with comfort, it works with truth. There is a moment when this perception becomes physical. The body reacts to certain encounters as if it remembered something forgotten. The heart races, the stomach tightens, the gaze wants to flee. These are signs that the reflected image touches ancient layers of emotional memory. Life doesn't want to humiliate you, it wants to free you. That's why it repeats the scenes, changes the characters, but keeps the same plot until the lesson is absorbed. When you finally agree to look, something in the vibration changes. The mirror ceases to be an enemy and becomes a silent master. Seeing yourself in another's reflection is to traverse your own labyrinth. It is to understand that nothing external happens outside the tuning of consciousness. The other exists to show you the shape you project into the field. Everything that bothers you out there is asking for recognition within. What you love in others is what awakens in you the remembrance of your light. What bothers you is what still resists integration. There is an instant when the mirror widens. It's no longer just people, the environment, the sounds, the emotional climate of a place. Everything begins to reflect your internal state. Reality becomes malleable, as if it breathed along with your vibration. When the inner field is in disorder, the world responds with noise. When there is clarity, even chance seems to conspire in harmony. It's at this point that awakening begins to take on contours of responsibility. The mirror teaches that there is no outside, everything is correspondence. But integration is not romantic. It requires crossing shame, pride, guilt. It requires recognizing that the character you created to survive also built its own wounds. It's painful to realize that painful situations always carried your vibrational signature. And yet, it is liberating to understand that if you created it, you can also undo it. Consciousness is not hostage to shadows. It is the space where shadows become visible. Over time, the reflection stops frightening you. You begin to thank, silently, those who show you what still needs to be seen. Each conflict becomes a field of mirroring. What once seemed like an attack now reveals itself as an opportunity for expansion. Anger dissolves into lucidity. Judgment gives way to compassion. Not out of naive kindness, but because you realize it's useless to hate the mirror. The image it shows is you at another frequency. At certain moments, this recognition is so deep that the world loses the outline of separation. The line between I and other dissolves. Everything that happens seems to happen inside. The friend who welcomes, the stranger who irritates, the silence of dawn, all are part of the same vibrational organism. The awakened consciousness begins to perceive itself as a field, not as an isolated point. In this state, there are no culprits or victims, only resonances. Seeing yourself in the universe's mirror is like crossing a forest where every tree reflects a memory. You walk and recognize yourself in everything, in shadow, in light, in the fall, in the healing. It is in this recognition that duality begins to bend. Good and evil cease to be opposites and become polarities of the same movement of learning. The mirror shows that awakening is not about becoming pure, but whole. And when you finally see yourself in everything, something changes forever. The reflection dissolves, because there is no longer any distance between the one who looks and what is looked at. The entire universe becomes an extension of your own consciousness. The mirror fulfills its role and fades. And in that silent instant, the real begins to emerge with a different texture. Not as something that needs to be reached, but as something that has always been there, waiting for you to recognize yourself in it. Everything falls silent after the collapse. It is a silence so dense it seems to alter the air. What once had color now fades into a uniform tone. And the world, though it continues to exist, seems distant, almost imagined. There is no hurry, no direction, and time dissolves like sand slipping between your fingers. You try to move, but something in you refuses. It's as if life itself had stopped to listen to a sound that can only be heard inside the silence. This is the threshold of the void, the territory where the old self no longer lives, and the new has yet to breathe. No map serves here. No teaching, however luminous, offers shelter. Consciousness hovers in an interval between worlds, where the ground of form gives way and logic unravels. Everything that was familiar becomes noise. It is the exact point where the crossing begins, not as movement, but as suspension. In the first days, the void feels like punishment. There is a kind of loneliness that surpasses the presence of people. It is a silence that doesn't depend on the absence of sound, but on the absence of meaning. You watch the same scenes, the sun rising, the body waking, the voices speaking, but everything happens at a distance, as if life were being projected onto a thin fabric of unreality. It's hard to accept that this pause is not a punishment, but a purification. The universe suspends the noise so you can hear what has always been hidden beneath the din of existence. Nothing fits. Emotions oscillate without cause. The mind tries to create stories to understand what has no explanation. But the void is not to be understood. It is to be crossed. It asks for presence, not analysis. It's like being inside a starless night, where the only guide is the rhythm of your own breathing. Inhaling and exhaling become the thread that ties you to the real. Each sigh is a reminder that, even in nothingness, life keeps pulsing. The death of the self happens without drama. It doesn't come with flashes or revelations, but with a slow and almost tender unraveling. The character you believed yourself to be begins to fade. Memories lose authority, fears lose shape, desires dilute. The mind, deprived of answers, tries to resist. It creates anxiety, guilt, distraction, but none of that survives for long. The void doesn't fight, it absorbs. It welcomes everything and by welcoming, transforms. Within it, consciousness learns to look without seeking. It is the first rehearsal of true sight, the kind that doesn't choose what it wants to see, it simply witnesses. In the void, judgment has no use. Comparison becomes absurd. It's as if the world had been cleaned of noise, leaving only what is essential, the pure experience of being. This simplicity frightens because the ego was trained to feel real only when there is something to do. But here, doing is losing yourself. As time passes, the void begins to change texture. What was absence begins to pulse as presence. There is a kind of quiet life inside it, a cosmic breath that accompanies yours. You begin to feel that nothingness is not the opposite of being, but its foundation. The void is the womb of the real. It doesn't destroy, it gestates. Everything that is true is being prepared there, in the dark, out of reach of haste. There comes a point when the body senses this change before the mind. The air seems lighter, sounds clearer, and time, which once was an enemy, becomes an ally. You understand that silence is not the end of music, it's the pause that allows it to exist. The void is that pause in the symphony of the soul. It did not come to steal meaning, but to give it back its depth. And then something changes, almost imperceptibly. A small spark of presence lights up in the middle of nothing. There is no explanation, no event, only a gentle feeling that the void also breathes. This is the sign that the crossing is being completed. You did not leave the void, you learned to inhabit it. Awakening does not happen when the void ends, but when you realize it has always been the space that sustains everything. The silence between worlds is not life's interval, it is its foundation. And upon crossing it, what is born is not a new you, but a new way of perceiving the same world. Sharper, calmer, more real. Nothingness reveals itself as the whole at rest. And in this instant, the void ceases to be fear and becomes home. At the beginning, it seems that nothing has changed. The body wakes at the same time. The sun rises on the same side. The voices around keep repeating the same scripts. But there is something imperceptible in the air, an almost shy vibration that alters the texture of reality. The world is the same, and yet completely different. It is the gaze that has changed. Not the one you use to see with your eyes, but the one that perceives with consciousness. This new gaze does not light the world from the outside, it makes it shine from within. After crossing the void, the light does not arrive as revelation, it appears as remembrance. A discrete clarity begins to emanate from common things, as if the real breathed under a skin of mystery that was always there. The glow does not come from what you observe, but from the way you observe. Everything that once seemed banal, the steam of coffee, the sound of a gate closing, the touch of the wind, now carries a quiet depth. Life, once seen from the outside, reveals itself from within. It is in this instant that the invisible begins to manifest, not in visions or miracles, but in subtle perceptions, the synchronicity of events, the sensation that time folds, the recognition of a presence that accompanies you without form or voice. You do not see with the eyes, but feel with the field. It's as if a new lens had been installed between being and the world. Sharpness increases, and with it, the responsibility to sustain this clarity without fleeing from yourself. The awakened gaze perceives the world not as a setting, but as a mirror. Everything reflects the observer's frequency. A calmer thought changes a room's temperature. A gentle gesture alters the rhythm of an encounter. The universe begins to respond not to your words, but to your vibration. It is here that you understand the power of presence. It creates realities without needing effort. But this perception is not linear. There are days when the glow goes out, and the world again seems opaque. This is not regression, it is breathing. Consciousness, newly born into this new light, learns to expand and to draw back, like an energetic lung adjusting to the body. The oscillation between clarity and confusion is the way the field teaches you to keep the gaze alive without depending on form. The invisible glow is the prelude to manifestation. Before the world changes, the observer needs to see differently. When consciousness aligns with truth, the universe, obedient, reorganizes its particles. It is the quantum principle acting on an intimate scale. Reality collapses according to the vibration of the gaze. That is why, Awakening is not about conquering new worlds, but about seeing the same world with new eyes. At this point, presence becomes language. Words are no longer enough, and silences gain density. You begin to understand what the ancients called seeing with the heart. It's not a metaphor, it is direct perception. The light of the heart is a frequency that crosses the visible and reaches the subtle field of everything. To look with it is to dissolve judgment and allow the world to reveal what it truly is. Over time, this new vision changes the way you walk. There is a lightness in gestures, a calm in thoughts. Hurry turns into rhythm, and the body learns to follow the tempo of consciousness. The invisible glow teaches you to inhabit the instant, as if time itself breathed in you. The now ceases to be an interval and becomes a dwelling. And then something extraordinary happens, yet without spectacle. The world begins to recognize you. People, places, and events align as if they were responding to a music only you can hear. Life, once random, becomes dialogue. Everything that arrives brings a message. Everything that leaves a teaching. Reality, shaped by the new gaze, begins to vibrate in coherence. This is the quietest and most powerful phase of awakening. When the gaze changes, the universe reorganizes itself. The light doesn't come from outside. It reveals itself from within. And in realizing this, you understand that there is nothing to achieve, only something to allow. The invisible glow is the way the soul breathes when it remembers who it is. If upon reading these words, you felt something move inside you, a memory, a shiver, a small expansion of presence, close your eyes for a moment. Breathe and observe the space around you with this new gaze, without haste, without naming. Then, share in the comments a simple sentence, like a vibrational seal. I see the light that cannot be seen. Write this if something in you recognized this silent glow. And if you felt that this text lit something in your field, like this video as one who inwardly confirms, I choose to see from within. Thus, each of your gestures becomes a living reflection of this invisible light that now begins to awaken in the world. After the invisible glow, something unexpected happens. The light that seemed to expand without limit begins to descend. It condenses, draws nearer, seeks form. The spirit, which just moments ago saw itself as vast as space, is now called to fit into the body again. This is one of the most subtle and challenging movements of awakening, to return into form without losing the breadth of being. The return is not regression, it is integration. At first, there is discomfort. The body, accustomed to being directed by the mind, must now learn to respond to consciousness. It carries the memories of everything the being lived while it was fragmented, the tensions, the fears, the automatisms. Each muscle seems to hold old stories that no longer know where they fit. It's common to feel tiredness, sensitivity, as if the body were trying to recalibrate itself to sustain the new vibration. The density of matter seems too slow for the rhythm of the soul, but it is precisely in this friction that the miracle happens. Consciousness begins to perceive the body not as an obstacle, but as a sacred instrument. Each cell is a meeting point between the invisible and the tangible. The body is not a prison, it is a temple. It is the means through which the infinite experiences the instant. Fully inhabiting the body is allowing the light to find density, the spirit to become gesture, the unsayable to translate into breath. In the return, touch becomes language. The hands recognize textures as if touching for the first time. The air seems thicker, and even sound gains contour. You feel the pulse of life in every small movement, the blood running, the heart responding, the skin vibrating with the world. The body ceases to be something you have and becomes something you are. This reconciliation is the beginning of a new form of presence, being whole where you are. However, this integration is not simple. The body, now more sensitive, reacts to everything. Places, people, words, foods. Everything begins to have a direct impact on the vibration. It's as if the soul had adjusted the volume of feeling, and any dissonance were immediately perceived. Many are frightened by this intensity, try to protect themselves from the density of the world. But awakening is not an escape from matter. It is a dance with it. The body should not be avoided. It should be listened to. It is the radar of the real. When consciousness begins to listen to the body, it discovers that the body always knew what the mind ignored. The body knows when something is true, knows when there is harmony, knows when something wounds the field. It speaks through sensations, and each discomfort is a message. Learning to inhabit the body is learning to translate these messages without fear. The body is the compass the spirit uses to move through the world. There is a tenderness in this return. The soul, which previously sought transcendence, begins to love the experience of being incarnate. Touch, smell, the texture of simple things. Everything gains a value that once seemed insignificant. The body comes to be seen as the most beautiful expression of the mystery, a temporary form that carries the eternal. It is the home where the universe experiences itself in flesh. Over time, you begin to realize that the light did not come down to the body. It was always in it, just waiting to be remembered. The body is the meeting point between the invisible and the visible. Each breath is a portal. Each heartbeat is a wave of coherence, vibrating between dimensions. To inhabit the body is to allow consciousness to dance with time without losing itself in it. This return is also an act of humility. After touching the absolute, the challenge is to accept washing the dishes, feeling pain, waiting in lines, dealing with the everyday. The spiritual ego resists, wants to remain in the sublime, but awakened consciousness understands. The divine is not above form, it is within it. It is in the ordinary gesture that the infinite manifests most purely. Enlightenment does not happen outside life. It happens in life. And then something stabilizes. The body becomes transparent, not in the physical sense, but energetic. The light moves through it without resistance. Actions become more precise, words more essential, the gaze calmer. Presence becomes radiant, but without effort. It is the spirit fully incarnate, not as an ideal, but as a natural state. When consciousness learns to inhabit form, life ceases to be a sequence of events and becomes a continuous flow of expression. Each movement, each breath, each pause is a silent prayer. The body becomes the altar where the infinite celebrates the instant. And in this recognition, everything that is ordinary gains a new glow. The return to the body is the point where heaven touches earth within you. It is the moment when the light decides to remain, not to flee from matter, but to make it its dwelling. This is where awakening becomes life, palpable, breathable, present. After learning to inhabit the body, something changes in the way the world communicates. It is no longer only sounds, words, or gestures that arrive. There is a subtler language manifesting in the between the lines of the real. It is a listening that does not happen in the ears, but in the field of presence. The universe begins to speak in vibrations, and each event becomes a message in energetic code. The awakened soul discovers that silence is the original language of existence. At first, this new listening seems strange. What used to be coincidence now sounds like a response, a casual phrase, a song at the exact moment, an unexpected breeze. Everything carries intention. It's as if the universe breathed with you and modulated its signals to dialogue with your vibration. The mind, accustomed to deciphering linear meanings, becomes confused. But consciousness understands. Real communication is not linear, it is resonant. What matters is not the content, but the frequency with which something arrives. Listening to the field is like tuning in to a station that has always broadcast, but that only now you can pick up. The frequency was there all along. Mental noise, fear, and haste were the interferences. When the interior quiets, the sound of the world changes. There are pauses that speak. There are silences that instruct. The universe ceases to be a setting and becomes an interlocutor. This listening is not only passive, it is a constant exchange. Consciousness emits and receives simultaneously, shaping what it perceives. The field responds to what you vibrate, not to what you say. Therefore, learning to listen is also learning to vibrate with intention. Vibration is how the soul speaks, and the field responds with mathematical precision, returning experiences that correspond to your frequency. Thus, the dialogue with the universe becomes a mirror. Each event reveals the tone of your own inner sound. Over time, you begin to perceive that everything is communication. The body, for example, speaks through sensations: heat, weight, lightness, contraction. The environment speaks through synchronicities, repetitions, pauses. Even chance, which once seemed blind, reveals itself as an attentive messenger. Life is a set of signals coded in vibration, and the ear that translates them is presence. The more present you are, the clearer the message. But listening to the field requires surrender. The ego wants to control the conversation, wants immediate answers, wants proofs. Awakened consciousness learns to listen without expectation. Sometimes, silence is the answer. Other times, the absence of a signal is the invitation to remain. The field also speaks through what does not happen, and understanding this is to understand cosmic patience. Everything reveals itself at the exact rhythm in which the being is prepared to listen. This silent listening is also a form of healing. When you begin to hear the world without filtering, the body itself reorganizes, the mind slows down, the heart opens, the energy balances. Presence becomes an expanded ear, and through it, the universe harmonizes around you. Listening deeply is aligning yourself with the frequency of life. The sound of the field is the sound of coherence. At certain moments, this communication becomes almost visible. You think of someone and that person appears. A thought of gratitude seems to attract luminous events. A silent intention reorganizes entire situations. It is not magic, but tuning. The field is sensitive to the vibration of consciousness, and when you emit in clarity, the universe responds in exactness. Reality becomes a sonorous mirror, returning the exact tone you project. The new listening is also a new form of prayer. There is no supplication, no formula. There is attention. The true request is attentive silence. The true answer is the presence that feels. You no longer seek to hear God. You become the ear through which the divine listens to itself. Everything merges into the same pulse of vibration. The field and the being breathe together. There is beauty in this way of existing. Walking becomes a meditation. Breathing becomes conversation. Each step is a word spoken with the ground. Each gaze is an exchange of information with the invisible. You begin to understand that nothing is really still. Everything is pulsation. Everything responds. Everything communicates. Reality is a living organism, and you are a conscious cell within it. Over time, silence ceases to be the absence of sound and becomes full presence. It is in it that the field speaks most clearly. It is in it that answers arise without questions needing to be formulated. Listening to the field is trusting that life speaks before you need to understand. When this listening matures, the entire world becomes a vibrational text. Each sound, each gesture, each event is a fragment of this great cosmic conversation. You realize that the universe was never mute. It was you who spoke too loudly. Now, the sound of the real can finally be heard. The silent dialogue with the field is the point where awakening becomes communion. There is no longer separation between the one who asks and the one who responds. There is only the flow of life, whispering in vibrations that the soul recognizes without translation. And when everything grows quiet inside, a new listening is born. Not the one that seeks to understand, but the one that simply feels. And in that feeling, the entire universe responds with the purest sound there is, the sound of existence itself being heard by itself. Everything changes the moment you realize that reality does not end where sight reaches. There is something beyond forms, a vibration that fills the spaces between things. The air seems more alive, the outlines of people become less rigid, and a silent certainty arises within. Nothing is purely matter. The wall vibrates, sound breathes, time pulses, like an organism. The universe is no longer outside. It happens with you, within the same invisible wave. It is the moment when the world ceases to be a stage and becomes a mirror. Each object, each event, each emotion becomes a reflection of a field that vibrates beneath your attention. Quantum awakening begins when the gaze perceives that to observe is to participate. The simple act of existing influences the way the universe behaves. There is no longer any distance between observer and observed. Both are aspects of the same consciousness, in constant dialogue. The first reaction is astonishment. How can something so simple change so much? You realize you are not a separate being within the cosmos, but a living cell within an infinite body that thinks and feels through you. The energy that moves the stars is the same that moves your thought. What you call life is only a dense version of the same vibration that sustains everything. The mind, for an instant, tries to understand, but rational understanding is too small to contain the wonder of unity. The quantum state is not a theory, it is a direct experience. It is the moment you perceive that each thought creates a ripple in the fabric of the real, that each emotion is a force capable of altering the course of events. The field always responds, sometimes with synchronicities that seem too coincidental, other times with silences that force you to listen to what vibrates beyond words. Nothing is random, everything is response. In this new state of perception, time begins to behave differently. The hours do not follow a line. They bend, repeat, expand according to the intensity of presence. The past feels close. The future seems already existent. The now becomes the only point of power, the center where all probabilities gather, awaiting a gaze that collapses them into reality. Destiny ceases to be a line and reveals itself as a field of possibilities vibrating beneath consciousness. In the quantum state, you learn to create without forcing. Manifestations are not born from effort, but from coherence. The field does not obey tense will, but clear vibration. When thought, feeling, and action align, the universe responds with mathematical precision. That is why some call this point the coherence of being. It is when the frequency of the heart and the clarity of the mind unite and matter bends in harmony. But this power does not come without responsibility. Everything you vibrate returns. The field does not understand speeches. It understands frequencies. Doubt creates noise. Pure intention creates expansion. Anger distorts the flow. Forgiveness rebalances it. To live between the visible and the invisible is to live in transparency. It is no longer possible to hide what you feel. The universe reads vibration before it hears the word. Gradually, the separation between the spiritual and the everyday disappears. You realize that the sacred is not in altars, but in how you hold a glass of water, how you walk, how you think. Everything vibrates with the same luminous substance. The energy of the field begins to pass through simple gestures, and life, which once seemed divided between the material and the transcendent, becomes a single breath. At this point, reality begins to turn malleable. Coincidences multiply. Answers arrive without questions. Presence becomes the creative force. You notice that the universe has always been listening. It was only waiting for you to speak in the right language, the language of vibration. There is no more effort, only resonance. The field does not need to be conquered. It simply responds to what is authentic. With time, the fear of making mistakes disappears. Uncertainty becomes part of the dance. You understand that life is not a riddle to be solved, but a wave to be surfed with awareness. To live between the visible and the invisible is to accept the paradox. You are both what observes and what is observed. You are particle and wave, limit and infinity. The separation was only an optical illusion. The quantum state is the living remembrance that the universe is not something to be controlled, but something that mirrors you. It bends before clarity and distorts before fear. That is why true mastery does not lie in dominating the field, but in becoming transparent enough for it to flow without resistance. When that happens, the world does not change around you. It changes through you. The invisible begins to breathe within the visible, and reality becomes alive, flexible, conscious. You walk, and the ground forms beneath your feet. You think, and space responds. You feel, and the entire universe vibrates with you. Quantum awakening is that instant when the human and the divine breathe the same air, and you finally realize they have always been the same thing. After so much crossing, awakening reveals itself as something simple. You breathe, feel the body, look at the world, and everything vibrates in silent unity. There is no longer search, because there is no longer distance between the human and the divine. The real does not need to be understood, only lived. Each gesture contains the infinite. Each instant is the all experiencing itself. If you've come this far, write in the comments, "I awakened with the real." This way, I'll know this journey accompanied you to the end. And if you felt this living presence in every word, subscribe and stay with us. There is much more of this silence that speaks within the light.